Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of a story you think you know. Forget the Hollywood versions. To live it honestly was exhausting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. It begins, as these things so often do, with a single person. In the late summer of 1976, the air in northern Zaire was thick and heavy, saturated with the humidity that rises from the vast Congo River basin. It was a place of deep green, of impenetrable forests and red earth roads that turned to impassable rivers of mud in the rain. Here, in the Bumba zone, lay the small, unremarkable village of Yambuku. At its heart was the Yambuku Mission Hospital, a modest collection of brick buildings run by a handful of Belgian nuns. It was a beacon of modern medicine in a world still governed by ancient rhythms. It offered prenatal care, treated malaria, and delivered babies. Its most vital and ultimately most fatal service was the daily clinic, where villagers would line up for injections of vitamins and medicine. For each patient, one of the 4 nuns or their Zairean assistants would prepare a syringe. There were only 5 glass syringes in rotation each day. Between patients, the needle would be given a cursory rinse in a pan of lukewarm water. It was a measure of efficiency born of scarcity. It was also a perfect mechanism for disaster. On the 26th of August, a man named Mabalo Lekela, the 44-year-old headmaster of the local mission school, returned from a tour of the northern forest near the border with the Central African Republic. He had purchased smoked antelope and monkey meat along the way, a common practice. He seemed perfectly healthy. A week later, on September 1st, he presented at the hospital with what he thought was malaria. He had a severe headache and a high fever. The nuns, following standard procedure, gave him an injection of chloroquine, but the fever did not break. Instead, it was joined by a constellation of terrifying new symptoms: uncontrollable vomiting, raging diarrhea, soon stained with bright red blood. His gums began to bleed. His eyes turned crimson as the small vessels within them burst. His body seemed to be dissolving from the inside out. The nurses who tended to him watched in horror as his personality changed, shifting from quiet stoicism to agitated confusion. Mabalo Lekela died on the 8th of September, 14 days after his fever began. His family, following the sacred rites of their community, washed his body by hand, preparing him for a traditional burial. They had no way of knowing that in these final, intimate acts of love and grief they were anointing themselves with a killer. Within a week, the people who had cared for Mabalo were falling ill. A nun named Sister Firmina, who had been at his bedside, a patient who had been in the bed next to his, then the women who had prepared his body for burial. One by one they arrived at the mission hospital with the same fever, the same headache, the same inexorable slide into hemorrhagic shock. The illness moved with the cold logic of a spiderweb, from Mabalo to his family, from the hospital to other patients who had received injections from the same unsterilized needles that had pierced his skin, from those patients to their families. The small clinic, a place of healing, had become an engine of amplification, a central pump pushing the disease out into the surrounding villages. The local people gave it a name. They called it the Yambuku sickness. They watched as their loved ones collapsed, as their bodies broke down in ways that defied all explanation. Panic began to curdle into terror. Families locked themselves in their homes. Others fled into the forest, hoping to outrun a predator they could not see. The Belgian nuns trapped in the epicenter sent increasingly desperate messages out by radio. They spoke of a plague. They reported that 17 of their own dedicated staff, including 2 of their fellow sisters, were now dead. The hospital was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. The government of Zaire, led by the formidable and unpredictable Mobutu Sese Seko, finally understood that this was not a localized anomaly. He sealed off the entire Bumba zone, quarantining over 500 villages, no one in, no one out. The army was deployed to enforce the cordon sanitaire. Inside this sealed region, a population of 500,000 people was trapped with an invisible monster, and the world, just beginning to learn of the crisis, could only watch and wait. The enigma of Yambuku was no longer a local tragedy. It was a global threat, simmering in the heart of the African continent. The desperate pleas from Zaire finally found their way to the quiet, sterile corridors of the World Health Organization in Geneva and the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, Belgium. A young Belgian scientist, a 27-year-old named Peter Piet, was one of the first to encounter the agent of this terror. A blood sample, taken from one of the dying nuns and carefully packed in a blue thermos flask, had made the long journey from Kinshasa to his lab in Antwerp. Under the powerful lens of an electron microscope, Piet and his colleagues saw something they had never seen before. It was not a bacterium. It was not a familiar virus like influenza or yellow fever. It was something wholly alien, long, filamentous, thread-like particles. Some were straight, others were curved into a U-shape or a characteristic shepherd's crook. They looked, as one scientist would later remark, like strands of spaghetti. They were elegant, almost beautiful in their strange symmetry, and they were utterly menacing. They recognized it as a relative of the Marburg virus, which had emerged in Germany 9 years earlier, but this was clearly something new, something distinct. At the same time, a similar sample had arrived at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. There, a virologist named Patricia Webb, working in the CDC's most secure laboratory, the newly designated Biosafety Level 4, confirmed the finding. It was a new virus. The highest security protocols were enacted. The world's virological community buzzed with a mixture of scientific excitement and profound dread. An international commission was hastily assembled. It was a small, intrepid group of experts from Belgium, the United States, France, and South Africa, tasked with flying into the heart of a raging epidemic. Their leader was a veteran American virus hunter from the CDC, Carl Johnson. He was a man who understood the logistics of outbreak response, the delicate dance of science, politics, and fear. They boarded a C-130 Hercules transport plane in Kinshasa, loaded with tons of equipment, plastic isolators, protective suits, generators, microscopes, and sterile supplies. It was a mobile laboratory, an expeditionary force bound for a war zone where the enemy was microscopic. Landing on the dirt airstrip in Bumba, they were met with a wall of heat and the palpable tension of the quarantine. They were entering a world paralyzed by fear. The roads were empty. The villages were silent. They established their base of operations at the now-abandoned Yambuku Mission Hospital. The place was pristine, eerily clean. The remaining nuns had scrubbed everything before they, too, had succumbed or been evacuated. But the ghosts were everywhere. The team moved through the wards where just weeks before hundreds had died. Their job was threefold: to identify the cause of the disease, to understand how it spread, and, most importantly, to break the chain of transmission. The field work was grueling and perilous, clad in heavy protective gear that felt like personal saunas in the equatorial heat. They went from village to village. They were medical detectives, tracing the path of the virus from person to person. They drew blood from the sick and the recovering, carefully documenting every contact. They quickly confirmed what the local pattern of death had already suggested. The mission hospital had been the primary amplifier. The reuse of just a few contaminated needles had sparked a firestorm. But the secondary spread, the person-to-person transmission through close contact with blood and bodily fluids, particularly during traditional burial rituals, was what sustained the inferno. They mapped the outbreak, creating genealogies of infection that showed, with chilling clarity, how one sick person could lead to dozens of deaths. They were working against the clock with limited resources in a high-stakes environment where a single tear in a glove could be a death sentence. Their very presence was a source of suspicion. Rumours swirled among the local population that they, the foreign doctors, were the ones spreading the disease, or that they were there to steal the blood of their people. They had to navigate not just a deadly virus, but a landscape of deep-seated cultural beliefs and profound distrust. As the team began to contain the outbreak through painstaking contact tracing and the introduction of safe burial practices, a quiet but significant conversation took place. The virus needed a name. Standard virological practice often involved naming a new agent after the place where it was first identified. The Yambuku virus was the logical choice. But the scientist, led by Carl Johnson, felt a deep sense of unease with this. They had witnessed the terror and the suffering in the village. They had seen the stigma that was already beginning to attach itself to the survivors and their families. To name the virus after Yambuku would be to brand the village forever with the mark of this plague. It would be a permanent stain, a cartographical scar that would haunt its people for generations. They wanted to avoid this. Looking at a map, they searched for a geographical feature nearby, something neutral, something that belonged to the land itself rather than its people. Their eyes fell upon a small dark line snaking through the landscape not far from the mission. It was a river, a tributary of the larger Congo. In the local Lingala language, its name was Legbala. On their map, it was marked with its French name Ebola, the Ebola River. It seemed fitting. A river flows, it carries things away. It has a power that is both life-giving and destructive. It was anonymous, yet evocative. And so, in a small act of cartographic empathy, they made their decision. The agent of the Yambuku enigma, the terrifying thread-like particle that had brought a region to its knees, would be known to the world as the Ebola virus. It was a name chosen not to pinpoint a source of shame, but to draw a veil of mercy over it. The story, however, was far from over. It was in fact happening twice. While the international team was grappling with the horror in Zaire, an entirely separate drama was unfolding, almost entirely unnoticed by the outside world, some 500 miles to the north across the border in southern Sudan. The two outbreaks were unconnected, unaware of each other, like two identical fires sparked by two different lightning strikes in the same vast dry forest. This parallel terror began in late June of 1976, 2 full months before Mabalo Lekela ever felt his first fever. The setting was not a mission hospital, but a place of industry, a sprawling cotton factory in the town of Nzara. Nzara was a company town, a hub of commerce and labour, a stark contrast to the world's small-scale agricultural life of Yambuku. The first recognised case was a man known to history only by his initials, YG. He was a storekeeper in the factory, a man who worked in a backroom filled with bats. He fell ill on June 27th with a fever, headache and chest pains. He died on July 6th. The diagnosis was malaria. His death was followed by that of his co-worker, PG, then another. An illness began to ripple through the factory workforce. Unlike in Zaire, where contaminated needles provided a brutally efficient superhighway for the virus, the transmission in Nzara appeared to be slower, more intimate. It seemed to pass between workers who shared close quarters, who drank from the same cups, who touched one another in the course of a long day's labour in the hot, dusty factory. The disease in Sudan presented differently too. While it was just as lethal, the severe hemorrhagic symptoms seen in Zaire, the dramatic bleeding from every orifice, were less common. Instead, the Sudanese patients suffered more from joint pain and inflammation of the mouth and throat. It was a subtle, yet significant variation on the theme. From the factory, the virus hitched a ride with the sick. One infected worker travelled to the nearby town of Maridi for medical care. There, he was admitted to the Maridi General Hospital, a facility larger but no less prepared for this kind of onslaught than the small mission in Yambuku. The hospital staff, working without gloves, masks, or any real concept of barrier nursing, began to fall ill. The Maridi hospital became the second epicenter of the Sudanese outbreak. The virus burned through the wards and the staff with terrifying speed. Of the 230 people who worked at the hospital, 76 would become infected, and 41 of them would die. The outbreak in Sudan was larger, more widespread, and in some ways more insidious than the one in Zaire. It infected 284 people and killed 51 of them, a case fatality rate of 53%. This was lower than the nearly 90% fatality rate seen in Zaire, another clue that scientists were dealing with something slightly different. By the time a small WHO team finally arrived in Sudan in October, the outbreak was already beginning to wane, having burned through the most susceptible populations. The doctors and epidemiologists who investigated found a scene of chaos and exhaustion. They pieced together the story, tracing the chains of infection back from the Maridi hospital to the Nzara cotton factory, and ultimately to that first cluster of cases around the storekeeper YG. It wasn't until the blood samples from Sudan were analysed and compared to the samples from Zaire that the full chilling picture emerged. The viruses were related, clearly members of the same filovirus family. They looked identical under the electron microscope, but genetically they were distinct. They were cousins, not twins. The virus from Zaire was one strain, the virus from Sudan was another. They had emerged independently at roughly the same time in two different countries, from two different animal reservoirs, to prey on two different human populations. This revelation was profound. It meant that 1976 was not a singular freak event. It was not a one-off biological accident. It was a discovery. The world had not just met Ebola, it had met the Ebola viruses. The outbreaks in Zaire and Sudan established a terrible precedent. They demonstrated that this new enemy was not a lone assassin, but a family of killers lurking silently in the natural world, capable of spilling over into the human population at any time, in any place where the delicate boundary between the wild and the settled world was breached. The twin nightmares of 1976, born in a quiet mission hospital and a noisy cotton factory, served as the world's brutal introduction to a threat that would recede but never truly disappear, a river of blood that would continue to flow, intermittently but mercilessly, through the decades to come. After the firestorm of 1976, a strange quiet descended. For 17 years, the world outside of a few specialized virology labs largely forgot the name Ebola. The virus, having made its terrifying debut on the world stage, seemed to perform a vanishing act, retreating from the headlines and into the deep, quiet places of the earth. But it did not disappear entirely. It left echoes, faint and sporadic whispers in the dark, reminders that it was not gone, merely dormant. In 1970, a single case surfaced in the Tandala region of Zaire, a woman who fell ill after receiving a vitamin injection at a local mission. It was a faint but direct echo of the Yambuku outbreak, a single dying ember from that great conflagration quickly extinguished. Then silence again for 2 years. In 1999, the virus returned to the place of its other birth, to southern Sudan. It was the same strain, Sudan Ebola virus, and it bloomed once more in the town of Nzara, the very community that had suffered so grievously just 3 years prior. The pattern was horribly familiar. A worker at the local cotton factory fell ill, and the infection soon found its way into the hospital, the great amplifier of disease. But this time something was different. The world, or at least the small part of it dedicated to fighting these fires, was a little wiser. The lessons of 1976 had been learned, albeit imperfectly. The international response was faster. The principles of isolation and barrier nursing, rudimentary as they were deployed with a greater sense of urgency. The outbreak was smaller, 34 cases, 22 deaths, a tragedy for the families involved, but a footnote in the annals of epidemiology. The virus had tested the world's memory and found it just strong enough to prevent a repeat of the first disaster. And then, once again, it vanished. For a decade, the jungle kept its secrets. The virus stayed hidden. Scientists in their sterile, high-containment laboratories could only speculate. They debated its origins, its hiding place, this mysterious natural reservoir. They knew it had to be somewhere, ticking away silently in some unknown creature, waiting for the right moment, the right chance encounter to spill over into a human being and begin the cycle anew. They searched, but the forest is vast, and the list of potential hosts is nearly endless. They tested insects, rodents, primates. They found nothing. The trail went cold, leaving only a lingering sense of dread among those who knew what the virus was capable of. It was a monster that left no footprints. And then, in 1989, the monster knocked on a very different door. Not a mud brick hut in Central Africa, but a sterile, concrete quarantine facility in Reston, Virginia, a quiet suburb just a stone's throw from the political heart of the United States. The facility, run by a company called Hazelton Research Products, was designed to hold primates, mostly cynomolgus macaques, imported from the Philippines for medical research. In early October, a shipment of 100 monkeys arrived. Within a month, they began to die. They died with a speed and ferocity that alarmed the facility's veterinarians. Their spleens were enlarged, their intestines filled with blood. The initial diagnosis was simian hemorrhagic fever, a known and dangerous pathogen, but one confined to monkeys. The facility sent samples to the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, or USAMRID, at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This was, and is, the military's frontline defense against biological threats. There, in a biosafety level 3 lab, a civilian technician named Dan Dalgard began to examine the tissue samples under a microscope. He found a virus, but it didn't look quite right. For a definitive identification, he passed the samples on to the electron microscopy lab, run by a virologist named Tom Geisbert. Geisbert prepared the samples, placed them under the powerful beam of the microscope, and saw something that made the blood run cold. There on his screen were the long, filamentous shepherd's crook shapes he had only ever seen in textbooks and reference photographs. It was a filovirus. It looked for all the world like Ebola. The discovery sent a shockwave through USAMRID. The protocols were immediately escalated. Geisbert's boss, Peter Jarling, a man who had spent his career studying the world's deadliest viruses, confirmed the finding. It was Ebola, or something terrifyingly like it. A quiet, methodical panic set in. This wasn't a remote African village thousands of miles away. This was suburban Washington, D.C. The virus was inside a building with a commercial ventilation system, surrounded by homes, schools, and shopping malls. The logistical nightmare began to unfold. A secret, highly coordinated operation was launched, involving the CDC and the US Army. The goal was simple and brutal: to euthanize every single one of the nearly 500 monkeys in the facility, to decontaminate the building from top to bottom, and to do it all without alerting the public and causing a mass panic. Army teams in full-body biocontainment suits, the now iconic image of a modern plague, moved into the Reston Monkey House. For days they worked in the heat and the stench, systematically putting the animals down, bagging the carcasses, and sterilizing every surface with chemicals. It was a grim, silent, and efficient operation. Meanwhile, a different kind of fear was gripping the scientists. 4 of the animal handlers at the Reston facility had been They were tested, and the results were baffling. They had developed antibodies to the virus. Their immune systems had seen it, recognized it, and fought it off. But none of them had gotten sick, not so much as a fever or a headache. This was a profound scientific puzzle. The virus, which they named Reston Ebola virus, It was clearly a new strain. It was devastating to monkeys, killing them with the same efficiency as its African cousins. But for some reason, it was almost completely harmless to humans. The monster had arrived on the shores of America, had breached the walls, and then, inexplicably, had simply shrugged and walked away. It was a biological false alarm, dress rehearsal for a catastrophe that never came. The incident was a stark reminder of how easily a deadly pathogen could travel the globe in the modern era, hitching a ride in the cargo hold of an airplane. It also added a new layer to the central mystery. Now there wasn't just one Ebola, but several, each with its own personality, its own level of virulence. The silent years were over, but the questions were only growing deeper. The virus had shown that it could be anywhere, and that its family was larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. Where was it hiding? And when would the truly deadly branch of the family decide to make its presence felt again? The world did not have to wait long for the answer. After the strange, muted affair in Reston, the virus went quiet again for a few more years. A small outbreak in Côte d'Ivoire in 1994, another in Gabon. They were contained. They felt like aftershocks, but they were preludes. The main event, the catastrophe that would forever burn the image of Ebola into the global consciousness, began in the spring of '95, not in a remote village this time, but in a sprawling, chaotic and vibrant city of 500,000 people. Kikwit, in what was then Zaire. The story began, as it so often does, with a single person in a place of deep forest. In January of that year, a 42-year-old charcoal maker named Gaspard Menga was working in the forested hills outside of Kikwit. He fell ill with a fever, bloody diarrhea, and a headache. His family took him to the Kikwit General Hospital, a sprawling, underfunded, and overwhelmed institution. The doctors, lacking the resources for sophisticated diagnostics, treated him for what they thought was dysentery or typhoid fever, common ailments in the region. Gaspar Menga died, and his family took him home for a traditional burial, a ceremony involving washing and touching the body of the deceased, an act of love and respect that is, for a filovirus, a golden invitation. Soon after, the nurses who had cared for him, the family members who had mourned him, and the patients who had shared his ward began to fall ill with the same terrifying symptoms. The disease spread through the hospital like a wind-driven fire. The hospital, meant to be a place of healing, became the epicenter of the outbreak, the great amplifier. Healthcare workers, operating without gloves, without clean water, without basic protective equipment, became the primary victims. They reused needles out of necessity, drawing blood from one patient and inadvertently injecting a death sentence into the next. They cleaned the sick and the dying with their bare hands, completely unaware that the virus was teeming in every drop of sweat, blood, and vomit. An Italian nun working as a nurse was among the first to die. Then another, and another. Soon the medical staff was decimated. Fear emptied the hospital wards far more effectively than any quarantine order ever could. By April, the situation was spiralling out of control. The local authorities were overwhelmed. The Zairean government, crippled by corruption and instability, was slow to react. A local doctor trying to perform a C-section on an infected pregnant woman was sprayed with blood and died days later. The disease was now spreading out into the city itself, carried by grieving relatives and fleeing patients. It was the nightmare scenario. A highly lethal, highly transmissible virus loose in a dense urban population. It was at this point that the outside world finally took notice. The World Health Organization, alerted by a team from Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, declared a major international emergency. What followed was one of the largest and most dramatic deployments of medical and scientific personnel in modern history. Teams from the CDC in Atlanta, the Pasteur Institute in France, public health agencies from Belgium and South Africa, and of course MSF, all began to descend on Kikwit. It was a race against time. They arrived to find a city gripped by terror. Rumours flew. Some said it was sorcery, others a biological weapon. Bodies were being abandoned in the streets. The Kikwit General Hospital was a ghost town, its remaining staff either dead, sick, or too frightened to work. The international teams knew they had to do two things simultaneously: stop the chain of transmission and win the trust of the community. The first part was a matter of brutal, painstaking logistics. The second was a far more delicate dance of culture, communication, and empathy. The core of the strategy was something called barrier nursing. It is a simple concept with an immensely difficult execution. It means creating an impermeable barrier between the healthcare worker and the virus. The teams, led by veterans like the CDC's Pierre Rollin and the WHO's David Heyman, established a new isolation ward in a cordoned-off section of the hospital. Anyone entering this zone had to don what looked like a spacesuit: impermeable gowns, double or even triple layers of gloves, rubber boots, masks, and protective goggles. The heat inside these suits, in the equatorial climate of Zaire, was suffocating. Goggles fogged up instantly, yet poured off the wool, drenching them within minutes. Every single procedure, from drawing blood to simply giving a patient a sip of water, became a slow, deliberate, and exhausting ordeal. And at the end of every shift, they had to go through a meticulous decontamination process, being sprayed head to toe with a chlorine solution, a chemical baptism to wash away the invisible enemy. The second part of the strategy was contact tracing. This was pure detective work. Teams of local and international epidemiologists fanned out across the city's sprawling neighbourhoods. For every confirmed case, they had to reconstruct the last days and weeks of that person's life. Who did they live with? Who did they work with? Who attended the funeral? They would then track down every single one of these contacts, sometimes dozens for a single case, and monitor them for 21 days, the maximum incubation period of the virus. It was a monumental task of social cartography, mapping the invisible pathways of infection through a terrified city. They went door to door, explaining, reassuring, taking temperatures, battling fear and superstition with patience and science. At the same time, another team tackled the most dangerous and culturally sensitive aspect of the outbreak: burials. Traditional burial practices were a primary engine of transmission. The Red Cross organised local volunteers into burial teams, trained them in safe procedures, and provided them with protective gear. These teams, often ostracised by their own communities, performed the difficult task of retrieving the bodies of the dead from their homes, disinfecting the houses, and providing a safe, dignified burial. They were performing a vital public health service, but in the eyes of many they were violating sacred traditions. They were unsung heroes, walking into the heart of the danger armed with chlorine sprayers and body bags. Unlike the outbreaks of the 1970s, Kikwit unfolded under the full glare of the global media. Satellite trucks were parked outside the isolation ward, beaming harrowing images back to newsrooms in London, New York, and Tokyo. The world watched, mesmerised and horrified. The images of aid workers in their otherworldly protective suits, the grieving families kept at a distance, the quiet, efficient work of the burial teams. These visuals became iconic. They seared the reality of Ebola into the world's collective imagination. It was no longer an abstract, exotic disease from a forgotten corner of the world. It was a clear and present danger, a vision of a potential global plague. Slowly, painstakingly, the methods began to work. The combination of isolating the sick, tracing their contacts, and ensuring safe burials began to bend the curve. New cases started to decline. The chains of transmission were being broken one by one. By July, the outbreak was declared over. It had infected 315 people and killed 254 of them, an 81% case fatality rate. It was a victory for public health, a testament to the courage of the local and international responders. But it was a sobering victory. Kikwit was a warning. It demonstrated that in an increasingly interconnected world, an outbreak anywhere could become a threat everywhere. And it left the biggest question of all hanging in the air, more urgent than ever. The international teams had proven they could put out the fire, but no one knew where the sparks were coming from. The hunt for the natural reservoir, the virus's secret hiding place, was about to begin in earnest. The aftermath of Kikwit created a new sense of urgency in the scientific community. It was no longer enough to react to outbreaks. They had to be predicted, perhaps even prevented. And to do that, they had to solve the central mystery of Ebola. Where did it live between its devastating appearances in humans? This question launched one of the great biological detective stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It was a search not for a lost city or a hidden treasure, but for a microscopic killer's lair, a hunt for what scientists call the natural reservoir. The reservoir host is an animal species that can carry a pathogen over long periods, often without getting sick itself, acting as a permanent source of the virus in nature. Finding it would be the key to understanding how and why spillovers into the human population occurred. The search was a process of elimination on a massive scale. For years, scientists ventured into the forests of Central and West Africa, the so-called Ebola belt, collecting samples from every conceivable creature. They were virological prospectors, sifting through the immense biological diversity of the jungle for a trace of a deadly ghost. They trapped and tested thousands of rodents. They collected legions of insects and spiders, grinding them up into a slurry to search for viral RNA. They took blood and tissue samples from reptiles and amphibians. The work was slow, methodical, often frustrating, and carried out in some of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. Setting up a mobile laboratory in the middle of the Congolese rainforest, with intermittent power and stifling humidity, is a logistical feat in itself. Every sample represented hours of trekking through dense undergrowth, setting traps, and carefully handling animals that could, in theory, be carrying the very pathogen they were looking for. And for years, the results were always the same: negative. The virus was nowhere to be found. For a time, suspicion fell heavily on non-human primates. Gorillas and chimpanzees were known to be susceptible to Ebola. In fact, outbreaks in human populations were often preceded by mass die-offs of local ape populations. They were like the canaries in the coal mine, a stark and tragic signal that the virus was active in the area. But they couldn't be the reservoir. They died from the disease just as readily, if not more so, than humans. A good reservoir host doesn't die. It endures. It coexists with the virus. The apes were fellow victims, not the ultimate source. They were another dead end in the investigation. Slowly, over time, a new and compelling suspect emerged: bats. The hypothesis made a great deal of sense from an ecological and virological perspective. Bats are mammals, which makes viral jumps to humans more plausible. They are ancient creatures, giving viruses eons to co-evolve with them. Their immune systems are extraordinary, uniquely capable of tolerating viral loads that would be lethal to almost any other mammal. This is partly due to the metabolic demands of flight, which generates a constant low-level fever and keeps their immune systems in a state of high alert, allowing them to manage but not eliminate viral infections. Furthermore, they live in vast, dense colonies, sometimes numbering in the millions, providing the perfect environment for a virus to circulate and persist. And they travel enormous distances, capable of carrying a pathogen across entire regions. They checked all the boxes for a perfect reservoir host. The challenge was proving it. The hunt now focused on the chiropteran world. Scientists like Eric Leroy, a French veterinarian and virologist, dedicated their careers to this pursuit. Their expeditions became nocturnal affairs. They would venture into caves or set up enormous fine-meshed mist nets in the forest at dusk, waiting to gently entangle bats as they flew out to forage. Each captured bat was a small victory. It would be carefully removed, identified by species, and then sampled. A swab from the mouth, a swab from the rectum, a small blood sample from a vein in the wing. It was delicate and precise work, often performed by the light of a headlamp deep in the jungle. The vast majority of the bats would then be released unharmed back into the night. For years, this painstaking work yielded tantalizing clues, but no definitive proof. The teams were looking for two things: antibodies to Ebola in the bat's blood, which would indicate a past infection, or, the Holy Grail, fragments of the virus's own genetic material, its RNA, which would indicate an active infection. In the early 2000s, Leroy's team and others began to find what they were looking for. During investigations into outbreaks in Gabon and the Republic of the Congo, they captured thousands of bats from hundreds of different species. And in the blood of three specific types of fruit bat, the hammer-headed bat, Franquet's epauletted fruit bat, and the little collared fruit bat, they found antibodies against Ebola Zaire. A few individuals even tested positive for fragments of viral RNA. This was a watershed moment. It wasn't the smoking gun they had dreamed of. They had not managed to isolate a live, infectious Ebola virus directly from a wild bat. That final, definitive piece of proof remains, even today, incredibly elusive. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The footprints of the killer were all over the bat's immune systems. They had found the hiding place. It was not in the soil, or the water, or in some mysterious insect. The reservoir was in the sky. This discovery painted a clearer picture of how a spillover event might occur. The virus, circulating harmlessly within a fruit bat colony, could be shed in their saliva, urine, or feces. A human might become infected by hunting and butchering an infected bat for bushmeat, a common practice in many parts of Central Africa. Or perhaps more commonly, the transmission could be indirect. A bat might nibble on a piece of fruit and drop it to the forest floor, where it is later picked up by a chimpanzee or a duiker, a small antelope. That animal becomes infected and sick, and is then hunted by a human, creating a bridge for the virus to cross from its reservoir into its next victim. The first patient in the 1976 Yambuku outbreak, Mabalo Lokela, was known to have purchased monkey meat at the local market. Gaspar Menga, the first patient in Kikwit, was a charcoal maker who spent his days in a forest teeming with bats. The 2-year-old boy who was patient zero in the Great West African epidemic of 2014 was believed to have been playing near a hollow tree that housed a colony of bats. The connections were no longer speculative. They were rooted in a plausible, scientifically supported chain of events. The hunt for the reservoir was a triumph of persistence, a slow grinding victory won not in a hospital ward, but in the deepest parts of the forest, by scientists armed with nets, swabs, and an unshakable determination to solve the puzzle. It revealed that Ebola is not an alien invader that strikes from nowhere. It is a part of the natural world, an ancient fellow traveller with one of evolution's most successful creatures. The outbreaks were not acts of malice, but biological accidents, moments of terrible bad luck when the barrier between the wild world and our own is breached. Understanding this didn't make the virus any less deadly, but it transformed it from a mysterious, almost supernatural monster into something that could be understood, tracked, and, perhaps one day, predicted. The quiet, methodical work of the reservoir hunters had provided the first crucial chapter in the playbook for preventing the next great Ebola catastrophe. The old millennium sighed its last, and the new one arrived, not with fanfares and fireworks for everyone, but with a quiet, creeping dread in the red earth of northern Uganda. The year was 2000. The place was Gulu district, a region already hollowed out by nearly 2 decades of brutal insurgency by the Lord's Resistance Army. Here, life was not lived in ancestral villages, but in the sprawling, desperate squalor of internally displaced persons camps. Hundreds of thousands of people packed together by the grim necessities of war, their lives a holding pattern of fear and uncertainty. It was a perfect petri dish, and something was growing. It began, as it so often does, as a mystery. A strange illness marked by sudden fevers, vomiting, and a diarrhea that would not quit. Then came the bleeding. Local health officials, overwhelmed and under-resourced, thought it might be a particularly vicious wave of Shigella, or perhaps cholera. But the death toll climbed with an unnatural speed, and the pattern of its spread was terrifyingly intimate, moving through families like a curse. By October, the truth could no longer be ignored. Samples were sent, tests were run, and the ghost of 1976 returned. It was Ebola. Specifically, it was the Sudan Ebola virus, the slightly less lethal but no less determined cousin of the Zaire strain. This was not just an echo of the past, it was its largest, most terrifying resurgence to date. The response was a study in organised chaos, an attempt to build a fortress in the middle of a hurricane. The World Health Organization, the American CDC, and Doctors Without Borders descended on Gulu. They found a health system that had been bled dry by years of conflict. There were few doctors, fewer nurses, and a population deeply, and perhaps rightly, suspicious of any authority. The first task was immense: build an isolation ward. At St Mary's Lecourt Hospital, a Catholic mission hospital that had been the region's medical backbone, wards were cleared. Plastic sheeting, that ubiquitous and flimsy barrier against a microscopic enemy, was stapled to walls and draped over the windows. A line was drawn on the ground with chlorine. On one side was the world, on the other the hot zone. The logistics were a nightmare. Contact tracing, the foundational act of epidemic control, was nearly impossible. How do you track the movements of people who are already displaced, who move between camps and towns in a constant fluid search for safety or sustenance? How do you ask a family already traumatized by war to recount every person they've touched in the last 3 weeks? The teams did it anyway. They moved through the camps, clipboards in hand, their questions a gentle intrusion into unimaginable grief. They were mapping the virus's social network, trying to get one step ahead of its relentless march. The work inside the isolation ward was a slow, deliberate dance with death. The personal protective equipment, the now famous PPE, was stifling in the Ugandan heat. Donning it was a ritual of layers: boots, 2 pairs of gloves taped at the wrist, a full-body suit, an apron, a mask, a hood, and goggles. Breathing became a conscious effort. Vision was narrowed to a small fog-prone window. In these clumsy suits, nurses had to perform the most delicate of tasks: inserting an IV into a dehydrated patient, cleaning a body racked with hemorrhagic diarrhea, or just offering a cup of water, a small act of humanity that carried with it a universe of risk. One of the heroes of the outbreak was Dr. Matthew Laquire, the brave medical superintendent of the Lecker Hospital. He worked tirelessly, living at the hospital, leading his staff from the front. He knew the risks. He had seen too many of his own nurses and staff fall ill. And then, in early December, he too developed a fever. He isolated himself immediately. He knew the protocol better than anyone. He died 5 days later, a casualty of the war he had fought so valiantly. His death was a devastating blow to morale, a symbol of the immense price being paid. By the time the Gulu outbreak was declared over in January of 2001, it had left an indelible scar. 425 people had been infected. 224 of them had died. It was, at the time, the second largest Ebola outbreak ever recorded. It had demonstrated that the virus could thrive not just in remote forests, but in the dense, fractured societies created by human conflict. It was a warning, a very clear one. For a few years, the front went quiet, but the virus was not sleeping. It was simply elsewhere. In 2007, the alarm sounded again, this time from the west of Uganda, in Bundibugyo district, a mountainous region pressed up against the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. The reports were familiar. a mysterious illness, fever, bleeding, and rapid death. An immediate response was mobilized, built on the hard-won lessons of Gulu. Samples were collected and sent for analysis, a routine procedure now. The assumption was that it would be Sudan strain again, or perhaps Marburg. The results that came back were confusing. The tests for every known strain of Ebola and for Marburg were negative, yet the patients were clearly dying of a viral hemorrhagic fever. The international teams on the ground were fighting a phantom. They were treating patients, establishing isolation, conducting burials, all without knowing the name of their enemy. In the high-security labs at the CDC in Atlanta, the virologists were puzzled. They ran the tests again, still negative. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a genuine mystery. So they turned to the slow, methodical work of genetic sequencing, painstakingly charting the virus's genetic code from the patient samples. And then they found it, a sequence that was clearly related to Ebola, but distinct from any of the 4 known species: Zaire, Sudan, Reston, and the rarely seen Thai forest. It was a 5th branch on a deadly family tree. A new cousin had just introduced itself to the world. They named it with the simple geographic frankness of virology, Bundibugyo Ebola virus. The discovery was a moment of profound scientific importance and profound unease. It confirmed that the virus was not a static entity, not just a handful of known quantities. It was an adaptable, evolving family of pathogens, capable of generating new species, new threats that could emerge without warning from the deep reservoirs of the natural world. This new Bundibugyo strain was less lethal than its relatives, with a case fatality rate of around 37%. But that was cold comfort. The monster could change its face. It could have other unknown siblings waiting in the shadows of the forest. The map of our fears had just gotten bigger. Uganda had become a proving ground, a place of terrible education. It had taught the world how to fight Ebola in a war zone, and it had revealed that the enemy was more varied and more cunning than anyone had ever suspected. To understand the ferocious spread of this virus, we must step back from the microscopes and the isolation wards and enter the quiet, sacred spaces where communities grieve. The story of Ebola is not just one of virology and public health. It is a story of anthropology, of culture and of love. Specifically, it is a story of how we say goodbye to our dead. In many of the cultures of West and Central Africa, death is not a sterile medical event. It is a deeply communal and tactile passage. The body of a loved one is not a vessel to be disposed of. It is the person, imbued with spirit and memory, deserving of one final profound act of care. This care is expressed through touch. Imagine a village matriarch has passed away. Her daughters, her sisters, her nieces, the women of the family will gather. It is their solemn duty and their honour to prepare her for her journey. They will tenderly wash her body, an act of purification and respect. They will anoint her with oils, dress her in her finest clothes, and braid her hair. They will hold her hands, kiss her forehead, and whisper their farewells. This is not a morbid task. It is an act of supreme love, the final thread in a tapestry of kinship woven over a lifetime. The funeral itself is a public affair. The entire community comes to pay respects. People will file past the open casket, touching the deceased one last time, a gesture of connection and shared grief. The body may lie in state in the family home for days, allowing relatives from far and wide to travel and say their goodbyes. Now, overlay the life cycle of the Ebola virus onto this ancient and beautiful tableau. The virus is a master of tragic irony. In the final hours of life, as the body's systems begin to fail, the viral load explodes. The virus is present in astronomical numbers in every single drop of bodily fluid: blood, vomit, diarrhea, sweat, tears. The moment of death and the hours immediately following are precisely when the body is most infectious. It becomes, in essence, a vessel of pure contagion. So the very acts intended to honour the dead become the virus's most powerful tools of transmission. The loving wash of a daughter's hand spreads the virus from her mother's skin to her own. A farewell kiss becomes a death sentence. The communal grief of an entire village, gathered around a single body, becomes a super spreader event, a term we now know all too well. From that one funeral, dozens of new chains of infection can be ignited, branching out like the roots of a great poison tree. An aunt carries it back to her village. A cousin takes it to the city market. Each new infection will culminate in a week or two in another funeral, another set of rituals, another explosion of the virus into the community. It is a feedback loop powered by love itself. This created an almost insurmountable challenge for the public health workers who arrived to fight the outbreaks. Their message was a violation of the most deeply held beliefs. They came in their strange, terrifying plastic suits, looking like alien invaders, and they said, "You cannot touch your mother. You cannot wash your father. We must take your child away and put them in a plastic bag." To the community, this was not a medical necessity. It was an act of profound disrespect, an attack on their culture and their humanity. They were not just taking a body, they were stealing a soul, denying it the proper rights to join the ancestors. The resistance was immediate and in its own way completely understandable. Families would hide their sick, fearing they would be taken to an isolation ward to die alone, their bodies never to be returned. They would conduct secret burials in the middle of the night, hastily digging graves in their backyards to avoid the authorities. The response teams, in turn, were seen as body snatchers, ghouls who profited from death. Rumours flew that they were harvesting organs, or that they had brought the disease themselves. This mistrust was a greater barrier than any logistical challenge. You cannot fight a virus if the community you're trying to protect sees you as the enemy. The breakthrough came when public health organisations realised they had to stop fighting culture and start working with it. The goal was not to eliminate rituals, but to adapt them. Thus was born the concept of the safe and dignified burial. It was a masterpiece of applied medical anthropology, forged in the heat of crisis. The teams began to work with, not against, community leaders, the imams, the priests, the village elders. They explained the science of transmission in simple, respectful terms. They didn't say, "Your traditions are wrong." They said, "This disease has temporarily made your traditions dangerous. Let us find a new way to honour your dead, a way that keeps the living safe." The new process was a compromise. The specialised burial teams, still in their full protective gear, would handle the deceased, but they would do so with transparency. They would go to the family home and explain every step. The body would be placed in a sealed body bag, but the family could watch from a safe distance. Before the bag was sealed, a family member might be allowed to place a photograph or a favourite piece of clothing inside. The team would offer to say a prayer, or to allow a religious leader to officiate from a distance. At the gravesite, the family could gather and mourn. They could throw the first handfuls of dirt onto the coffin, a crucial part of the grieving process. It wasn't the same. It was a sterile, mediated version of an intimate rite. But it was something. It provided a measure of closure. It showed respect, and most importantly, it broke the chain of transmission. The safe and dignified burial became one of the single most effective tools in ending Ebola outbreaks. It was a recognition that you cannot save lives by destroying a community's soul. You have to save both. And so, with these lessons learned in the smaller, contained infernos of Central and East Africa, the world felt a grim sense of readiness. It had a playbook. It understood the virus's cultural dance partners, but it was a playbook designed for a brush fire, not a continent-spanning conflagration. And in the final days of 2013, in a tiny forgotten village, a spark landed in a tinderbox that had been drying for decades. The village is called Meliandou. It sits deep in the forested hills of southern Guinea, in a prefecture called Gwekedu. It is a place of deep green canopy and red earth, where the borders of Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia blur into one another. These are not hard frontiers, policed and fenced. They are suggestions on a map, easily crossed by people whose families, markets and histories have always straddled these imaginary lines. It is a place of immense mobility, a perfect launching pad for an epidemic. Sometime in December of 2013, a 2-year-old boy named Emil Wamuno fell ill. He had a high fever, he was vomiting, and he had black tarry stools. He died on December 6th. The prevailing theory, a piece of virological forensics, is that Emil had been playing near a large hollow tree near his home. The tree housed a colony of Angolan free-tailed bats, a species known to be a potential reservoir for the Ebola virus. Perhaps he was exposed to their droppings. Perhaps he caught and played with an infected bat. We will never know for sure. All we know is that he was the first. Patient zero of the apocalypse to come. A week later, Emil's 3-year-old sister, Philomene, died. Then his mother, pregnant with her next child, died. Then his grandmother. The illness spread to the midwife who had attended his mother. She in turn carried it back to her home village. With each death came a funeral. With each funeral came more infection. It was a quiet, deadly bloom, radiating outwards through the tight-knit webs of family and community. But no one knew what it was. In this region, which had never ever seen Ebola before, the symptoms were mistaken for other, more familiar killers. Cholera, Lassa fever, even anthrax was considered. There was no frame of reference for a disease so swift and so lethal. For 3 crucial months, from December 2013 through February 2014, the virus moved like a ghost. It travelled in taxis and on motorbikes, a silent passenger on the currents of everyday life. It crossed into the market towns where people from all 3 countries converged to trade goods and news. It infected healthcare workers in small rural clinics who had no gloves, no gowns, no concept of the danger they were facing. These nurses and doctors, trying to save lives, became the epidemic's most tragic and effective amplifiers. They treated the sick, became sick themselves, and then were treated by their colleagues, creating new chains of infection within the very institutions meant to heal. The virus that had landed in this unprepared region was Zaire ebolavirus, the original killer from 1976, the most lethal member of the family, with a case fatality rate that could reach 90%. The Guinean Ministry of Health began to hear reports of an alarming mystery disease in the south, but the information was patchy, the distances were great and the system was slow to react. It wasn't until March that a team from Doctors Without Borders, responding to the escalating alerts, took samples and sent them to a laboratory in Lyon, France. On March 21, 2014, the confirmation came back. It was Ebola. By then it was far too late. The virus was not confined to a handful of villages. It was loose. It had a 3-month head start. Its first jump across a border was almost certainly into Sierra Leone. The story centres on a respected traditional healer from the Kailahun district. Guinean families, desperate for a cure that their clinics could not provide, brought their sick relatives to her. She was renowned for her powers. She treated them. She contracted the virus herself. When she died, her funeral was a major event. Hundreds of people attended, coming from all over the district to pay their respects to a woman who had healed so many. They washed her body. They touched her. They mourned her. And they carried the virus home with them. It is believed that this single funeral was responsible for seeding more than 300 new cases of Ebola in Sierra Leone. The jump into Liberia was just as quiet, just as mundane. A woman from Lofa County, which borders Guinea, had travelled across to visit sick relatives. She became infected and then travelled back home. She died in a small Liberian clinic, infecting the healthcare worker who treated her. That healthcare worker then travelled to the capital, Monrovia, seeking better care for himself at a larger hospital. He did not travel in an ambulance. He shared a taxi. This was the critical difference. In all previous outbreaks, from Yambuku to Gulu, the virus had remained largely rural. It had burned through isolated villages, and its own lethality, combined with the relative immobility of the population, had helped to contain it. But now, for the first time, Ebola was moving into densely packed, impoverished urban centres. Cities like Monrovia and Freetown, the capitals of Liberia and Sierra Leone. These were places still deeply scarred by more than a decade of horrific civil war. Their public health infrastructure was not just weak, it was shattered. There were, in all of Liberia, a country of over 4 million people, barely 50 doctors. Hospital wards were dilapidated, often lacking running water, let alone a steady supply of electricity or basic medical supplies. It was a perfect storm, a confluence of factors that created an unprecedented catastrophe. You had the most lethal strain of the virus, introduced into a region that had no experience with it. You had its silent, undetected spread for 3 months, allowing it to build up a formidable, invisible momentum. You had the location, a highly interconnected tri-border area where people moved constantly. And you had the collision of the biological firestorm with the broken post-conflict health systems of 3 of the poorest nations on Earth. The brush fire had become a forest fire, and it was about to race towards the cities where millions of people lived, and where the world would finally be forced to watch in horror as the West African inferno began. By the summer of 2014, the fire was no longer contained. What began as a spark in a hollow tree in rural Guinea had become a vast, uncontrolled conflagration consuming 3 nations. The numbers, once a trickle, were now a torrent. In Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia, the virus was moving faster than any human response. The official counts, grim as they were known to be profound underestimations. The true scale of the disaster was whispered in villages where half the inhabitants had vanished, and shouted in the overwhelmed corridors of makeshift clinics where the sick lay on floors, waiting to die. The delicate threads of society were snapping one by one. Markets closed. Farmers abandoned their fields. The trust between neighbours, between families, between citizens and their governments evaporated like morning mist under a cruel sun. Ebola was no longer just a medical crisis. It was a societal collapse in slow motion. For months the world had watched with a kind of detached pity. It was a tragedy, certainly, but a distant one, happening over there, to them. But the virus did not respect borders drawn on a map. In July, a sickened Liberian American government official named Patrick Sawyer, febrile and vomiting, boarded a commercial flight. He collapsed at the airport in Lagos, Nigeria, a mega city of 21 million people. With that single act of travel, the nightmare of every epidemiologist was realised. The regional blaze now threatened to become a global inferno. The international community, which had been sluggish and complacent, finally awoke with a jolt of primal fear. On the 8th of August 2014, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Margaret Chan, stood before the world's media. The words she spoke were carefully chosen, but their weight was immense. She declared the West African Ebola outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, a PHEIC. It's a formal bureaucratic designation, a piece of institutional jargon. But what it really meant was a global scream for help. It was the sounding of a planetary alarm bell. An admission that this was no longer a local problem that could be handled by a few brave doctors and a handful of NGOs. This was now everyone's problem. The declaration triggered a response of a scale never before seen for a disease outbreak. It was ponderous and chaotic, a giant waking from a long slumber, but it were massive. Military forces from the United States, the United Kingdom and other nations were mobilized not to fight a human enemy, but to fight a microscopic one. Their mission was not combat, but logistics. They were sent to build hospitals. The US military's Operation United Assistance saw uniformed engineers and logistics experts descend on Liberia, tasked with constructing dozens of Ebola treatment units, or ETUs. These were not gleaming modern hospitals. They were sprawling complexes of white tents and plastic sheeting, laid out with ruthless geometric precision to manage the flow of contagion. A hot zone for the confirmed sick, a warm zone for suspected cases, a green zone for the living. The British arrived in Sierra Leone with a similar mission, building and staffing treatment centres with their own army medics. The irony was palpable. These armies, designed for destruction, were now engaged in a desperate mission of preservation, their greatest weapon a bar of soap and a bucket of chlorine solution. And still, the virus outpaced them. The sheer difficulty of working in these countries was staggering. Supply chains, fragile in the best of times, were shattered. Airlines refused to fly to the affected region, creating a state of near total isolation. Getting a single box of gloves from a warehouse in Europe to a clinic in rural Liberia was a Herculean task involving military airlifts, crumbling roads, and terrified local officials. Money was pledged in the billions, but turning dollars in a bank account in Geneva into a functioning hospital bed in Monrovia was a slow, agonizing process. The true horror of this particular outbreak, the thing that made it so different from all the ones that had come before, was its setting. Previous Ebola outbreaks had occurred in remote, isolated villages. The virus would flare up, burn through a community, and having exhausted its fuel supply of interconnected humans, would die out, retreating back into the forest. It was a tragedy in miniature. But in 2014, for the first time, Ebola established a firm foothold in major capital cities: Conakry in Guinea, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and most devastatingly Monrovia in Liberia. Fighting Ebola in a dense, sprawling, impoverished urban slum is a fundamentally different challenge. It is like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol in the middle of a hurricane. In the countryside, everyone knows everyone. Contact tracing, the meticulous shoe-leather work of tracking down every person a patient has had contact with, is at least feasible. In a city of 1 million souls, a city of transients and anonymous crowds, it is nearly impossible. A sick man gets into a shared taxi. Who were the other passengers? He buys food at a market. Who did he brush up against? The virus thrived in the very anonymity of the city. In places like the West Point slum in Monrovia, a peninsula crammed with 75,000 people living in corrugated tin shacks, without clean water or sanitation, the disease spread with terrifying speed. Distrust of the government, already endemic, metastasized into outright paranoia. Rumours flew. The disease was a government plot. It was a Western conspiracy to harvest organs. The men in strange white suits were not there to help. They were there to take your loved ones away to die. When the government, in a desperate and ill-conceived move, tried to quarantine West Point with barbed wire and armed soldiers, the community erupted. Riots broke out. A temporary holding centre was overrun, and terrified, potentially infected patients fled back into the community, taking the virus with them. It was a perfect storm of poverty, fear, and contagion. The very public health measures meant to contain the virus were instead spreading it, because the currency of trust had been utterly devalued. And then, the fear went global. In late September, a man named Thomas Eric Duncan flew from Liberia, through Brussels and Washington, D.C., to Dallas, Texas. He had helped a sick neighbour in Monrovia, but he showed no symptoms when he travelled. Days after arriving in Dallas, he fell ill. He went to a hospital emergency room, mentioned his travel from Liberia, and was sent home with antibiotics. It was a catastrophic error. He returned days later, critically ill, and was finally diagnosed with Ebola. The United States, a nation that had viewed the crisis through the detached lens of a television screen, was suddenly gripped by panic. News channels ran endless loops of workers in hazmat suits decontaminating the apartment where he had stayed. The quiet suburban street became the epicenter of a national anxiety attack. Two of the nurses who cared for Duncan, Nina Pham and Amber Vinson, contracted the virus, despite following hospital protocols. One of them had even taken a commercial flight before her diagnosis. The fear became a political firestorm. Governors demanded travel bans. The 24-hour news cycle feasted on the story, amplifying the terror far beyond the actual statistical risk. Cases appeared in Spain, in the UK, in Germany. Each one was a spark that threatened to ignite a wildfire of public hysteria. The world was holding its breath, wondering if the invisible enemy that had brought 3 African nations to their knees was now coming for everyone else. But in the heart of that inferno, in the sprawling ETUs and the quarantined homes of West Africa, a different story was unfolding. It was a story not of fear, but of its opposite. Amidst the chaos and the collapse, there were people who, instead of running away from the fire, chose to run directly into it. In the suffocating humidity of Monrovia, Freetown and Conakry, heroes were being forged not in the heat of battle, but into the sterile, chlorinated confines of the hot zone. These were not soldiers with guns, but nurses with thermometers, doctors with IV lines, and grave diggers with shovels. The first and most numerous were the local healthcare workers, the Liberian nurses, the Sierra Leonean doctors, the Guinean ambulance drivers. They were the first line of defence, and they bore the heaviest cost. They went to work in hospitals that had become charnel houses, armed with little more than courage and a dwindling supply of flimsy gloves. They knew the risks better than anyone. They saw their own colleagues sicken one by one. They would share a morning tea with a friend, and a week later they would be treating that same friend in the Ebola ward. And then, a week after that, they would hear that their friend was gone. The psychological burden is impossible to comprehend. Imagine knowing that a single, momentary lapse in concentration, a needle prick, a tear in a glove, an accidental splash of fluid could be a death sentence. To Sheikh Humar Khan was a national hero in Sierra Leone, the country's leading virologist, a man who had treated over 100 Ebola patients. He understood the virus intimately. He was meticulous, careful, and still, it found him. His death, and the deaths of hundreds of other local healthcare workers, sent a shockwave of grief and terror through the medical communities. Yet the next day, his surviving colleagues put on their gear and went back to work. They had no other choice. It was their home, their people who were dying. Then there were the burial teams. In a culture where funeral rites are profoundly important, where washing and touching the body of the deceased is a final act of love and respect, Ebola committed its cruelest trick. The body of an Ebola victim is at its most infectious right after death. A traditional burial was a biological bomb. To stop the chain of transmission, the dead had to be made safe. This sacred duty fell to teams of young men, often volunteers who were shunned by their own communities. They would arrive at a home clad in their intimidating white or yellow suits to take away a loved one. They would face the grief and rage of families who saw them not as saviours, but as ghouls stealing their dead. They would carefully, methodically spray the body with chlorine, seal it in 2 body bags, and take it away for a swift, anonymous cremation or burial. They were performing one of the most essential tasks of the entire response, breaking the chains of transmission at their strongest link. For this, they were ostracised. Landlords evicted them. Shopkeepers refused to sell them food. Their own families turned them away, terrified that they were carrying the disease. They were heroes that no one wanted to touch. And into this chaos came the international responders. Organisations like the Red Cross, the WHO, and various government medical teams. But no group was more visible or more emblematic of this fight than Médecins Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders. MSF had been battling Ebola since its discovery. They were the veterans of this particular war. While the world was still debating the scale of the problem, MSF was already on the ground, setting up their first treatment centres, They had a system, a practiced, grimly efficient choreography for chaos. Their ETUs were built from pre-packaged kits, a hospital in a box. They understood the unforgiving logic of the virus. Their protocols were brutally rigid, born from decades of hard-won experience. The process of entering the hot zone was a ritual of transformation. A worker would be dressed by a colleague, each piece of personal protective equipment, the PPE, donned in a precise order. Boots, inner gloves, the hooded Tyvek suit, the apron, the mask, the goggles, the outer gloves. Taped at the wrists, the ankles, the zipper. Completely sealed. To step inside the hot zone was to step onto another planet. The world outside vanished, muffled by the layers of plastic and rubber. The only sound was the rasp of your own breathing amplified in your ears. The heat was instantaneous and oppressive. Within minutes you were drenched in sweat, your goggles fogging over. Communication was reduced to shouting through masks and using hand signals. The mission inside was a race against time, not against the virus, but against your own body. You had perhaps an hour, maybe 90 minutes, before dehydration and heat exhaustion would make you a danger to yourself and your colleagues. In that hour you performed your duties. You administered fluids. You gave medications. You cleaned up the vomit and diarrhea that were the hallmarks of the disease. You held a hand. You offered a word of comfort, your voice distorted by the mask, but mostly you bore witness. You saw the human cost of the statistics. You saw the fear in the eyes of the sick and the quiet dignity of the dying. The most dangerous part of the job was not being inside but getting out. The process of doffing or removing the PPE was the moment of maximum risk. Every surface of the suit was considered contaminated. It had to be removed with painstaking care, each piece peeled away without touching the contaminated exterior to your skin. A colleague would guide you, calling out instructions, spraying every surface, every glove with a potent chlorine solution. Step into the first bucket, spray. Remove the apron, spray. Remove the outer gloves, spray. It was a slow, deliberate dance, a counter-ritual to the one that got you in. Only when you were finally stripped down to your scrubs, standing in the clean zone, drenched in sweat and utterly exhausted, were you safe. And then, after rehydrating, you would rest. And in a few hours you would do it all over again. These workers, local and international alike, were a thin, porous line of defense, holding back a tidal wave of infection. They could not save everyone. In truth, in the early days, they could save very few. The mortality rate inside the ETUs was often over 70%. Their work was not about grand victories. It was about small mercies. It was about providing a place where someone could die with a measure of dignity. Away from their family, yes, but not entirely alone. It was about showing that in the face of an indifferent and merciless virus, humanity could still respond with compassion and courage. The sheer relentless human cost of this response, the sight of so many doctors and nurses becoming patients themselves, underscored a terrifying reality. Courage and chlorine were not enough. Humanity needed a better weapon. The 2014 epidemic, in all its horror, became the catalyst for one of the most remarkable scientific sprints in modern history, the race for a vaccine. For nearly 40 years, an Ebola vaccine had been a theoretical dream, a low-priority project in a handful of government and military labs. The reasons were coldly practical. Ebola was a disease of the poor erupting in remote parts of Africa. Outbreaks were sporadic and self-limiting. For a pharmaceutical company, the financial incentive was non-existent. There was simply no market. Developing a new vaccine is a monstrously expensive and time-consuming process, often taking a decade or more and costing upwards of $1 billion. There was no business case for investing that kind of capital to fight a disease that killed a few hundred people every few years in places with no ability to pay for it. So the research languished, moving at a glacial pace. Promising candidates sat in deep freezers in laboratories in Canada and the United States, their potential untapped. But the West African outbreak changed the entire geopolitical calculation. Suddenly, Ebola was not just a humanitarian tragedy, it was a global security threat. A virus that could shut down air travel, destabilize entire regions, and sow panic in Western capitals was a virus that demanded a solution. The money, which had been a trickle, became a flood. Governments, philanthropic organizations like the Wellcome Trust, and pharmaceutical giants like Merck and GlaxoSmithKline poured hundreds of millions of dollars into accelerating vaccine development. The projects that had been gathering dust were pulled from the freezers and fast-tracked with a velocity that was both breathtaking and, for those who had worked on them for years, deeply frustrating. The world was finally paying attention, but only after thousands had died. The leading candidate was a vaccine called RVSV-ZBOV. Its origin story was a testament to international collaboration. It was originally developed by scientists at the Public Health Agency of Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. They had ingeniously taken a common and relatively harmless livestock virus, vesicular stomatitis virus, or VSV, and genetically engineered it. They snipped out one of its genes and replaced it with a single, crucial gene from the Ebola virus, the gene that codes for the glycoprotein that studs Ebola's outer surface. The result was a clever biological mimic. The vaccine couldn't cause Ebola, but it looked enough like it to the immune system to provoke a powerful protective response. The Canadian government licensed it to a small American company, New Link Genetics, which in turn partnered with the pharmaceutical behemoth Merck to navigate the labyrinthine process of manufacturing and clinical trials. This acceleration created a profound ethical dilemma. How do you safely and ethically test an experimental vaccine in the middle of a raging, chaotic epidemic? The gold standard for medical research is the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. Some participants get the real vaccine, some get a placebo, and neither the participants nor the doctors know who got which until the end. This is the most scientifically rigorous way to prove if a vaccine works. But could you, in good conscience, inject a terrified person who has just been exposed to Ebola with a saline solution, a placebo, knowing they might have a 50% chance of dying a horrible death? The moral calculus was agonizing. The answer for many was no. A new, more nimble approach was needed. The solution came from the history books, from the successful campaign to eradicate smallpox decades earlier. It was a strategy known as ring vaccination. The concept is both simple and elegant. Instead of trying to vaccinate an entire population, you focus your efforts with surgical precision. When a new case of Ebola is confirmed, you don't just treat the patient. You immediately rush to identify every single person they have had recent contact with, their family, their neighbours, the people they shared a meal with. This is the first ring. You then identify all the contacts of those contacts, the second ring. You offer the vaccine to everyone in these rings, creating a cordon of immunity, a firebreak of protected individuals around the new infection, preventing it from spreading any further. It contains the spark before it can become a blaze. In 2015, as the epidemic was finally beginning to wane in Liberia and Sierra Leone, the last embers were still glowing in Guinea. It was here in the coastal communities of Basse-Guinea that the WHO, in partnership with the Guinean Ministry of Health, MSF, and other groups, launched the pivotal Ebola Sasufi trial, Ebola That's Enough. It was a logistical marvel. When a new case was identified, a mobile team would be dispatched within hours. They had to navigate difficult roads, gain the trust of frightened and suspicious villagers, and meticulously map out the social network of the infected person. And they had to do it all while carrying a vaccine that needed to be stored at a mind-bogglingly cold -80 degrees Celsius. This required sophisticated portable freezers and an unbroken cold chain from the laboratory in Europe to a remote hut in Guinea. The trial itself was a cluster randomized design, a clever compromise to the ethical problem. Entire rings or clusters of people were randomly assigned to either receive the vaccine immediately or to receive it after a 21-day delay. This allowed for a scientifically valid comparison while ensuring that everyone involved would eventually get the potentially life-saving shot. The results were stunning. They came in faster and were more definitive than anyone had dared to hope. Among the thousands of people who received the vaccine immediately, not a single one developed Ebola. It was 100% effective. The results were so clear, so overwhelmingly positive, that the trial was stopped early. The Data Safety and Monitoring Board declared it would be unethical to continue withholding the vaccine from the delayed vaccination group. Everyone would get it immediately. It was a monumental victory for science and public health, a beacon of hope in a story so often defined by tragedy. The RVSV-Zebov vaccine, later branded as Ervebo, was the weapon they had so desperately needed. It was not a cure, but it was a shield. The frantic race had been won, but it was a victory with a profound and sombre asterisk. It had taken the largest, most catastrophic Ebola epidemic in history, a disaster that claimed more than 11,000 lives, to finally push a promising vaccine across the finish line. The knowledge of how to stop the fire had been sitting in a freezer all along. It just took a world in flames to finally make someone go and get it. The official end of an epidemic is a strange, abstract thing. It's a date on a calendar, a declaration from a minister in a crisp suit, a collective sigh of relief from a world that had been holding its breath. For West Africa in 2016, it was a moment of weary celebration. The white tents could be struck, the last of the international aid workers could board their flights home, and the news cycle, ever hungry, could move on. But for those who'd walked through the fire and somehow emerged on the other side, the declaration meant very little. The virus, you see, is a poor respecter of official timelines. It leaves behind its own epilogue, a story written in the bodies and minds of the survivors, in the haunted silence of clinics stripped of their nurses, in the quiet desperation of a market with nothing left to sell. The war was over, but the occupation had just begun. For the tens of thousands who survived, victory was a complicated, conditional state of being. They had stared down a disease with a terrifying mortality rate and won, a feat of immense biological and personal strength. Yet, in the months and years that followed, many discovered that Ebola does not always grant a clean release. It leaves behind a collection of cruel souvenirs, a constellation of debilitating after effects that came to be known as post-Ebola syndrome. It was as if the virus, in its defeat, had seeded the body with phantom pains and lingering shadows. Survivors spoke of searing joint pain that made walking a torment, of a profound, bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. They described headaches that felt like a vice tightening around the skull, and a strange, persistent ringing in the ears. Perhaps the most terrifying of these vestiges was what the virus could do to the eyes. A significant number of survivors developed uveitis, a severe inflammation inside the eye that clouded their vision, caused intense pain, and, in some cases, led to blindness. It was a discovery that sent a chill through the medical community. The story of Dr. Ian Crozier, an American physician who contracted this disease in Sierra Leone and was evacuated to Emory University Hospital, became a chilling case study. Months after he was declared virus-free, his left eye began to ache. The pressure inside it soared, his vision blurred, and then, most unnervingly, the iris, the coloured part of his eye, began to change, shifting from a clear blue to a murky green. When ophthalmologists carefully extracted a tiny sample of fluid from his eye, they found it was teeming with active Ebola virus. The pathogen had found an immunologically privileged site, a place where the body's defences are naturally weaker, and had simply hidden there, dormant, a secret prisoner long after the war was supposedly won. This discovery had profound implications. It meant the virus could persist in survivors for months, even years, tucked away in bodily fluids, in semen, in spinal fluid, in the aqueous humour of the eye. This wasn't a zombie apocalypse scenario, not a case of the walking dead, but it was a complex public health reality. A survivor could, in very rare and specific circumstances, reignite a chain of transmission long after an epidemic was declared over. The hero's journey was suddenly complicated by a grim asterisk. But the physical scars were often easier to bear than the social ones. The word survivor, which should have been a badge of honour, became a brand, a label that separated individuals from their communities. In villages where entire families had been wiped out, a lone survivor was sometimes seen not with sympathy, but with suspicion. Why them? What dark magic had they employed to be spared? Fear, a far more contagious agent than any virus, poisoned the wells of community trust. Landlords evicted survivor tenants. Employers refused to rehire them. Friends would cross the street to avoid a handshake. Children were shunned in the schoolyard. The very people who had endured the most were now treated as pariahs, walking ghosts in their own hometowns. They were living reminders of a trauma everyone else desperately wanted to forget. And beyond the individual, the virus left deep structural wounds on the nations it had savaged. The healthcare systems of Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone, already fragile before the outbreak, were left in ruins. So many doctors, nurses and community health workers had perished on the front lines. They were, after all, the most exposed. Clinics that had once delivered babies and treated malaria were now empty shells, their staff gone, their supplies depleted. The intense focus on Ebola had created a devastating secondary crisis. While the world poured resources into fighting one disease, people continued to die in ever greater numbers from others. Measles outbreaks flared. Malaria went untreated. Mothers died in childbirth because there was no one left to attend to them. The healthcare infrastructure had not just been bent, it had been broken, and rebuilding it would be the work of a generation. The economies were similarly shattered. With quarantines and fear shutting down markets, restricting travel, and halting work, commerce ground to a halt. Farmers couldn't sell their produce. Miners couldn't go to the mines. Fields lay fallow. The vibrant, bustling lifeblood of these nations had been slowed to a sluggish, anemic crawl. The cost of Ebola wasn't just measured in the number of dead, but in the years of lost development, the setback in the slow, arduous climb toward prosperity. The world had learned a great deal during the West African epidemic, painful, bloody lessons in public health, logistics and communication. The final report card was bleak, and everyone knew, with a quiet dread, that there would be another test. That test arrived on the 1st of August 2018. The declaration came from the Democratic Republic of Congo's Ministry of Health, a sober announcement of a new Ebola outbreak. But this was different. This was not in a quiet, forested region near the river that gave the virus its name. This was in North Kivu and Ituri provinces, in the far east of the country, a place that had been embroiled in conflict for more than 2 decades, a place where over 100 armed groups operated, where government control was tenuous at best, and where the civilian population had learned, through bitter experience, to deeply mistrust anyone in a uniform or an official-looking vehicle. The virus, with its uncanny intelligence for finding the cracks in human society, had chosen the perfect theatre of operations, a war zone. But this time the world was not caught flat-footed. The horrors of 2014 had spurred a frantic global effort to develop the weapons that had been so desperately lacking, and now they were ready to be deployed. The first and most important of these was a vaccine, developed by the Public Health Agency of Canada, licensed to Merck, and fast-tracked through trials during the waning days of the West African epidemic, The RVSV-Zebo vaccine, brand name Ervebo, was a marvel of modern science. It wasn't a tool for mass immunization. Its brilliance lay in its strategic application. The strategy was called ring vaccination, a concept honed during the final successful push to eradicate smallpox. The idea was simple in theory, but fiendishly complex in practice. When a new case was confirmed, response teams would rush in. They would identify everyone the infected person had been in contact with, family, friends, neighbours, the person they sat next to on a bus, and vaccinate them. Then they would vaccinate the contacts of those contacts. It created a ring of immunity, a biological firewall around the active case, preventing the virus from finding a new host and spreading further. It was like fighting a forest fire, not by dousing the whole forest, but by creating a targeted firebreak just ahead of the flames. In the chaos of North Kivu, this was a Herculean task. Contact tracers, often local community members, had to navigate a landscape of fear and suspicion, asking deeply personal questions in villages where a stranger's arrival could be seen as a threat. Vaccination teams, escorted by UN peacekeepers for their own safety, would travel down precarious, muddy roads, sometimes for hours, to reach a single family in a remote location, carrying precious vaccine vials in special cold chain coolers. They were fighting a microscopic enemy in a region awash with macroscopic dangers. And there was another new weapon. For the first time, there were effective treatments. The standard of care in West Africa had been purely supportive: fluids to combat dehydration, electrolytes to maintain bodily function, and prayer. It was a battle of attrition, helping the body survive long enough to hopefully fight off the virus on its own. Now there were therapeutic drugs designed to directly attack the virus. In a landmark clinical trial conducted in the midst of the DRC outbreak, an astonishing feat of research ethics and logistics known as the PALM trial, short for Pamoja Tumoikia Moto, or Together We Fight the Fire, 4 different drugs were tested. 2 of them, both monoclonal antibody cocktails, proved remarkably effective. One, developed by Regeneron and later called Inmazeb, and another, derived from a survivor of the 95 Kikwit outbreak and called Ebanga, could dramatically increase a person's chance of survival, especially if administered early. The results were so clear that the trial was stopped ahead of schedule so that all patients could be given the life-saving treatments. This was a paradigm shift. Ebola was no longer an inexorable death sentence. It was becoming a treatable disease. The message to the community could now change. Instead of go to the treatment centre to protect your family from infection, it became go to the treatment centre because we can save your life. The survival rate for patients who sought care early and received these new drugs climbed to over 90%. It was a stunning medical victory. But this victory was won on the most difficult battlefield imaginable. The response was plagued by the very mistrust it sought to overcome. Rumours spread like wildfire that the epidemic was a hoax, a scheme by foreigners to steal organs, or a plot by the government to disrupt upcoming elections. This deep-seated suspicion was not irrational paranoia. It was the logical consequence of generations of exploitation, violence, and neglect. The responders, in their white Land Cruisers and protective gear, looked alien and intimidating. They were associated with an outside world that had brought little but suffering. This mistrust curdled into violence. Between January 2018 and June 2020, there were over 400 attacks on healthcare facilities and workers involved in the Ebola response. Treatment centres were burned to the ground. Health workers were attacked, abducted, and killed. In April 2019, Dr. Richard Muzoko Kibung, a dedicated epidemiologist from Cameroon working for the World Health Organization, was shot and killed during a meeting at a hospital in Butembo. He was there to save lives, and he lost his own. The response had to adapt. It became less about a top-down militaristic-style intervention and more about community engagement. Anthropologists were brought in to help responders understand local customs and burial practices. More and more, the response was staffed and led by Congolese doctors and community leaders who could bridge the trust gap in a way no foreigner ever could. They learned that fighting a virus in a conflict zone is as much a matter of sociology, politics, and trust building as it is of virology and medicine. It was a brutal, exhausting 2-year-long struggle. By the time the outbreak was finally declared over in June of 2020, it had become the second largest Ebola epidemic in history, with nearly 300 cases and over 200 deaths. It had been a showcase for humanity's best scientific tools and a stark reminder of its most intractable social failings. A new playbook had been written, but it had been written in blood. And so we arrive at the present, a world that lives in the long shadow of these outbreaks. Ebola has not been vanquished. It has merely retreated, for now, back to its quiet sylvan reservoirs, biding its time in the animal hosts that we still have not definitively identified. The threat endures. Flare-ups continue to occur, smaller and more manageable, but no less deadly for those they touch. In 2021, Guinea saw a resurgence, traced back to a survivor from the Great West African epidemic, a stark, real-world demonstration of the virus's capacity for long-term persistence. In 2022, Uganda faced a different challenge, an outbreak of the Sudan Ebola virus. This was a critical test, because the brilliant RVSV-Zebor vaccine, the hero of the DRC, is only effective against the Zaire Ebola virus. Against the Sudan strain, it was useless. It was a chilling reminder that Ebola is not a single entity, but a family of related killers, and we only have a shield against one of them. The Ugandan outbreak was eventually contained through classic shoe-leather public health. Rapid detection, rigorous contact tracing and isolation. It was a victory, but a precarious one. The current strategy for managing this enduring threat is one of perpetual vigilance. It is a quiet, unglamorous war fought not in emergency treatment centres, but in national laboratories and remote health posts. The key is surveillance. It means strengthening local healthcare systems so that a doctor in a rural clinic can recognise a strange fever, take a sample safely, and have it tested quickly. It means investing in genomic sequencing, a powerful tool that allows scientists to read a virus's genetic code. When a new case appears, they can now determine almost instantly if it is a new spillover from an animal, or a flare-up from a previously known chain of transmission. This knowledge is power. It shapes the public health response, guiding decisions on vaccination and contact tracing with a precision that was unimaginable just a decade ago. The world has built a better alarm system. Organisations like the Africa Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, born from the ashes of the 2014 crisis, now provide a framework for continental cooperation. The WHO's Contingency Fund for Emergencies can release money within 24 hours of an alert, rather than waiting weeks for international donors to write checks. The apparatus for response is faster, smarter and better funded than it has ever been. But an alarm is only useful if someone is listening and if they are prepared to act. Complacency remains the greatest enemy, and perhaps this is Ebola's most profound and lasting legacy. The hard-won lessons from Yambuku, from West Africa, from North Kivu, have become the foundational text for modern pandemic preparedness. The brutal, frantic education in how to fight a terrifyingly lethal virus has informed, on a global scale, how we confront other threats. When the world was faced with a novel coronavirus in 2020, the playbook that was dusted off was, in many ways, the one written during the Ebola epidemics. The concept of contact tracing, which became a household term during COVID-19, was refined and professionalised in the towns and villages of Liberia and Sierra Leone. The crucial importance of clear, honest public health communication and the catastrophic consequences of misinformation and political interference was a lesson taught in the starkest possible terms by Ebola. Most significantly, the race for a COVID-19 vaccine, which shattered every record for scientific development, stood on the shoulders of the Ebola vaccine effort. The global collaborations, the new vaccine platform technologies, the streamlined regulatory pathways, and the creation of entities like CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, were all direct outgrowths of the world's desperate scramble to arm itself against Ebola. The sense of urgency, the willingness to fund promising research at risk, the understanding that a pathogen anywhere is a threat everywhere, this was the mental framework forged in the Ebola crucible. Ebola, in its terrifying efficiency, taught us how a localized outbreak could become a global crisis. It was the dress rehearsal. It was the final exam for which we were woefully unprepared and for which we paid a terrible price. And in doing so, it gave us the tools, the knowledge, and the scars to face the next, even greater challenge. The virus remains a part of our world, a persistent, low-level hum of dread beneath the noise of our modern lives. It is a reminder of the fragility of our systems, of the thin veneer of order that separates a healthy community from a crisis. And it stands as a permanent, indelible testament to the fact that in the long, quiet struggle between humanity and the microbial world, there is no final victory. There is only vigilance, there is only preparedness, and there is only the hope that when the alarm sounds again, we will remember the lessons we learned in the dark.